ceased on the day after they had eaten some of the produce of the land, so that the sons of Israel no longer had manna. But they ate some of the yield of the land of Canaan during that year. Now it came about when Joshua was at Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries? Are you for us or against us?" He said, it's an odd answer. He said, "No." It wasn't like he really answered the question, but he said, "No, rather I indeed come now as captain of the host of the Lord." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, "What has my Lord to say to his servant?" The captain of the Lord's hosts said to Joshua, "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Does that sound familiar? It goes back to Mount Sinai with Moses. So let's talk first about this symbol of circumcision. So circumcision was this was a token, and it spoke mainly of this covenant that God had made with Abraham. And so some other key words in this paragraph would be the words "again." That was one of that I mentioned or underlined. "Again," and "sons." What was Israel reminded of by this symbol? So I have a lot of questions, and you're welcome to just, when I ask the question, just blurt out your answer. But what was Israel reminded of by this symbol? Well, they were reminded that they had a covenant with God, is what the symbol they were reminded of. Was this a new or an old symbol? Was this the first time it was talked about? No, it was an old symbol. But it was renewed at Gilgal, which means if you look up that word, it means a rolling wheel, or wheel rolling. That's why it said that there in verse 9, it says, "Today I've rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." So that name of that place is called Gilgal. What are some references to place and its significance? It was the place where God rolled away the shame and the reproach. Gilgal was the place where God rolled away the shame and the reproach of Egypt's bondage of God's people. And we're going to go back there and read Genesis 17, 1 through 14 here in a little bit. The next symbol is that of blood. Now, blood is not mentioned in verse 10, but blood was the main item of what? When you go back to the night that the death angel came through in Egypt, what was the significance of the blood? What's that? So they took the blood of the lamb, they spread it on the doorpost and on the lintel, which we call headers today. In modern construction, the lintel is called a header. So this was the blood was the main item of the Passover. Other key words in verse 10 is unleavened bread, and what was this a reminder to Israel about? The night that God passed over the homes of the Israelites, as long as they had the blood on the doorposts and the lintel. So this wasn't a new symbol. This was an old symbol, and it was renewed at this point at Gilgal. This is the third recorded Passover. The second recorded Passover was in Numbers 9, 1 through 14, and they're referencing back to the Exodus in Exodus 12, 1 through 20 as the Passover. We're going to go back and read all those scriptures here in just a minute. But the blood will be a sign, said the Lord, and the Lord will pass over when he sees the blood. The next section was about the manna, or the fruit, or the produce, or the grain. The fruit, produce, or grain, however your translation reads that. This replaced the temporary manna. Other key words in this section were unleavened bread, roasted grain, and I have written down that it stopped. What was Israel reminded of by this symbol of grain, manna? Come on, help me out. What was Israel reminded of? God's provision. That God provided for them when they were in the wilderness. They had nothing to eat, and God said every day there's going to be something that comes down. I think the psalmist calls it the bread of heaven, and it is an old symbol. The first instance of this is recorded in Exodus 16, 4 through 36, and it was a miraculous food that was provided daily by God, and it ceased once they were in Canaan. And we'll talk more about that in a minute too. I'm just kind of giving you the overview here. And then the last one is the sword. The one who held this was Israel's captain. Other key words in this section was neither or reverence or holy. And this was a reminder of God would be their strength, and God would be their leader. He would be their captain. And this is a new symbol. This has not been seen before, the sword of the captain of the Lord of hosts. They were getting ready for battle, and God appeared to Joshua to let him know that it was God who would be the commander and help them fight the battles that they were going to encounter. So as we read those, are there any other words that this is why if you do your homework, no, I'm just kidding, you'll come up with these words. But some other words that are found in these paragraphs besides circumcision was manna and sons. We got commander, holy, sword, roasted grain, produce, and so forth. Let's talk about these individually real quickly. We want to talk about what each one of these symbols was teaching Israel and teaching us too. Let's talk first about circumcision. Circumcision is that God was a symbol that God and Israel had a covenant. So I want you to turn to Genesis chapter 17. And I want to read the first 14 verses of that chapter. I want you to follow along with me in Genesis chapter 17, verses 1 through 14. This will give us some context as to why this was being done again. Now, when Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abraham and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. Abraham fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer will your name be called Abram, but your name will be Abraham. For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your descendants after you. I will give to you and your descendants after you the land of your sojourning, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. God said further to Abraham, Now as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. And you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. And every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations. A servant who is born in the house, or who is bought with money from any foreigner who is not of your descendants. A servant who is born in your house, or who is bought with your money, shall surely be circumcised. Thus shall my covenant be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. But an uncircumcised male, who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. So this circumcision was a symbol that God and Israel had a covenant. Now, circumcision was a practice that many ancient races, oftentimes for religious reasons, practiced. This wasn't solely a symbol for Israel. Many ancient races practiced this rite, or this ritual. The difference was, for the Israelite, the Hebrew custom was of divine origin. So it was something that God called for. And it was a seal of the covenant that God was establishing between himself and Abraham. In verse 7, he said that he would be God to Abraham and to his descendants. And Abraham would be the father of many nations. A multitude of nations is how the NASB reads. The land would be given to Abraham and his descendants. So circumcision was if you will, a ratification or a sign of this agreement or this covenant between Abraham and God. However, the outward sign, this was a covenant in the flesh, or a ratification or sign in the flesh. The outward sign was of no value if there wasn't also a circumcision of the heart. In Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 6, we can read these words. Moreover, the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, so that you may live. So this was very important, that they follow this symbol, follow this rite, but it wasn't just something that you do outwardly. So let's think about for us. We would say it would be important to accept Christ and believe in Christ. That's important. If you want to be saved, that's how we're saved, is believe in Christ and who he is, what he's done. But if we do that and we continue on with however we want to live, doing whatever we want to do, and our heart simply isn't in it, have we really done anything except have an outward show? So Paul in Romans, he said, the true Jew is the one who is circumcised in their heart, not just in the flesh. The heart is of utmost importance. So let's look at this Passover text. Passover that was a symbol that God would pass over the homes of the Israelites who had the blood on the doorposts and on the lintel or the header. Let's turn to Exodus chapter 12. And I want to read to you these verses 1 through 20 for some context. Now the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall be the beginning of months for you. It is to be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, they are each one to take a lamb for themselves. Now, as I read this, I want you to think about some words that you would underline or that you might highlight. And I want you to try to look and see how do we apply this to today and what it means today. So he said, on the 10th of this month, they are each one to take a lamb for themselves, according to their father's household, a lamb for each household. Now, if the household is too small for a lamb, in other words, if there's just 3 people in the house, they can't eat a whole lamb, then he and his neighbor nearest to his house are to take one according to the number of persons in them. According to what each man should eat, you are to divide the lamb. So I think about that, and I think, well, right now, just in our household, it's just me and Anita right now. So we can't eat a whole lamb, so I'd have to invite my next door neighbors to come and join me and figure out, okay, everybody can eat this much, so we could probably have 15 people here. So I got to find 15 people to come to my house so I can share the lamb with them. Do you get any application for that? Sharing the lamb, huh? You got it? Is that clear enough there, Aaron? Yeah. Your lamb shall be an unblemished male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to kill it at twilight. Moreover, they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the house in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that same night, roasted with fire, and they shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled at all with water, but rather roasted with fire, both its head and its legs along with its entrails. And you shall not leave any of it over until morning, but whatever is left of it until morning you shall burn with fire. Now you shall eat it in this manner, with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike down all. This is a really important verse, and I'm going to read some stuff from Michael Heiser in regards to this verse that I want to share with you. For I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. So all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. I'm going to stop there. We could go and read through verse 20 about the unleavened bread, the feast of unleavened bread. But let's talk about some of the items in this observance. One is the lamb. What would that represent for us? These are fairly simple questions, I think, or simple answers should be. The lamb, what is Jesus called? Yeah, the lamb was a type of Christ. The lamb that was slain from the foundations of the world. Jesus was slain. He was unblemished. He was pure. He was perfect. So this lamb is a type of Christ. The neighbor. These are just words that, as I went through and read it, these were words that stood out to me. The neighbor. They were sharing the lamb with their neighbor. We share Jesus with other people. We give him to other people so that they too can eat and have life. This is a male sheep or goat, which I thought was interesting. A lot of times we just think of a lamb as being a sheep, but it could also be a goat, a lamb goat. Then the blood. Oh, the blood. That was important. The blood, the scripture, what did it say? It says, when I see the blood, I'll pass over. And I believe that when we are covered with the blood of Christ's crucifixion, God looks at us and says, oh, they're pure, they're clean, they're good, because they've been covered with the blood of Christ. Not in a literal sense, but in a figurative sense, because we've accepted Christ. I also, the houses, the doorposts, and the lintel. It's kind of the opening into the home. Fire, unleavened bread, bitter herbs. And then I thought this was interesting. Girded, he says, eat it this way. You shall eat in this manner, with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. What does that mean? Why would he give those instructions, do you think? What's that? Better be ready to go. Absolutely. Because he's coming through and we've got to be ready to go. We need to be, and here's what I got out of that. I need to be ready whenever God's ready to move. If I'm lagging and dragging my feet, lollygagging around, and God's ready to move and I'm not, I'm going to miss it. You're going to miss it if we're just lollygagging around, not really paying attention. It reminded me of a parable in Luke chapter 14. It's verses 16 through 24. Most of us are familiar with this parable. Let's see, Luke 14. This is a parable that Jesus gives. He says, but he said to him, a man was giving a big dinner, and he invited many. And at the dinner hour he sent his slave to say to those who had been invited, come, for everything is ready now. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first one said to him, I have bought a piece of land, and I need to go out and look at it. Please consider me excused. Another one said, I've bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I'm going to try them out. Please consider me excused. Another one said, I have married a wife, and for that reason I cannot come. Now, these were people that had been invited. Okay? And then when the man said, it's ready, go get them, they all had excuses because they weren't prepared. They weren't ready for the invitation to come. The slave came back and reported this to his master. Then the head of the household became angry and said to his slave, go out at once into the streets and the lanes of the city and bring in here the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. And the slave said, Master, what you commanded has been done, and still there is more room. And the master said to the slave, go out into the highways and along the hedges and compel them to come in so that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of these men who were invited shall taste of my dinner. I believe that when they were commanded in Exodus to eat the Passover meal with their loins girded, their shoes on, their staff ready, God was just saying, you have to be ready when I'm moving. Too many times we put God in our timetable, we put God on our plans, and we want God to be a part of our plans. We've got it all wrong, folks. We have to be a part of his plan, don't we, Ruby? We have to be a part of his plan. He has the plan. And we need to say, God, I want to be ready. Let me know what it is, and I'll go with you and go with your plan. And then this verse 12 was an interesting verse to me. He says, for I will go through the land of Egypt, and this is in Exodus 12:12. He said, I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And then he throws this in there, and I can honestly tell you that I don't remember this. I know it's always been in there, but we always think about the man and the beast, the firstborn of those. But here's what God said after that. He says, and against all the gods, little g, of Egypt, I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now, if you'll allow me to read something from Dr. Michael Heiser's, this came off of his podcast, the Naked Bible Podcast, and it's from his book on angels. I think this is from the book on angels. This is a quote, so it's a little lengthy, but just listen carefully, and you'll see kind of these gods. Yahweh's mastery and control over creation order, as opposed to the fickleness of Pharaoh and his magicians, his Hartaman, that's the Greek word, and the gods of Egypt. It fits into decreation. The overturning of Maat, M-A-A-T, which is the cosmic creation order that the Egyptians believed in. So it overturns that. There is a decreation element. It demolishes the sense, the belief, and the hope that Pharaoh and Egypt's gods can control the world order or the cosmic balance. That was their belief, that Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt could control the cosmic order of the world. That was what they believed. That's how they lived their lives out. But this verse 12, where it says, and I will execute on the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgments, that attacks that thought, that Mot, the cosmic creation order. It attacks that, and by virtue of that, it is a polemic or a story against Egyptian religion and Egyptian theology. What they believe about Pharaoh as a god and their gods. So the application in this instance is pretty simple, actually. The final plague was transparently directed against the pharaonic succession, the succession of the pharaohs. His firstborn dies. You've seen the movie, The Ten Commandments. Pharaoh's firstborn dies. The gods had set up Mot, or the cosmic creation order, and it was supposed to be transferred from one incarnation of Pharaoh to the next in an unending and unbroken stream. So Pharaoh would die, his son would take over. His son would die, his son would take over. And this is how they believe their gods had set this up. But God said, against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. I'm the one that is in control of the cosmic order, the creation order. If you so he says, if you recall in earlier episodes, when a Pharaoh was dying or dead, it was a serious thing. The succession had to be orderly and according to plan, according to Mot, according to the will of the Egyptian gods, so that the balance of creation, the heavens and the earth, all of that, would be maintained and things would go on as usual. You would prevent the eruption of chaos in the land. Well, that's pretty much trashed in the final plague, because the God of Israel steps in and says, we'll show you who has power over the cosmic balance, the control of heaven and earth here, the life cycles. We'll show you who has control over order and chaos right here. He takes away the succession. The firstborn dies. This would be the son who was supposed to inherit the throne. The gods had set this up. They insinuated Pharaoh as the incarnation of Horus, or the son of Ra, to maintain divinely ordered Mot. or cosmic creation order. Pharaoh as the one who maintains order, who acquiesces to the gods, who through ritual keeps his commitment to the gods, and they will keep their commitment to Mot as well. This symbiotic thing is supposed to go on and on and on throughout eternity with no bumps in the road. However, this is a huge bump in the road. It upends the whole idea. All of this cosmic order and cosmic balance is not in the control of Pharaoh and his magicians and the gods of Egypt. This power is located really firmly in the hand of something else, someone else. That is the God of the Hebrews. And basically the Egyptians are at his mercy. And Pharaoh wants closure. He wants Moses and Aaron to bless him as he lets the people go because he knows he has no control over this situation. He's done. He's a broken man. He's a broken deity. And so are the rest of his gods because they can't intervene either. There's no ambiguity left in this picture. So he wants to know, quote, once I let these people go, things will return to normal. The God of the Hebrews has been appeased and we're done with all of this. So it's another assault on Egyptian religion. That's all he was wanting when he let them go, is he wanted things back to the order that the gods of Egypt had divinely ordained in his eyes. But God was saying, there's someone else in control. It is not you, Pharaoh. It is not your gods. It is not your magicians. And time after time, he showed that up until this very last time when he killed, right up until this last time when he killed the firstborn. So I thought that was just a fascinating take on this verse 12, where it says, I will, on the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. No matter what they think or how they go, I'm the Lord, and I'll do what I want to do. I'll disrupt the whole order because I am the one that controls it. Some significant phrases in this is the Lord's Passover in Exodus 12. The blood shall be a sign for you. I will pass over you. The day will be a memorial to you. So that was the first Passover in Exodus. The second Passover occurs in Numbers chapter 9. We're not going to read that. But then after that Passover, there is no Passover for 40 years, the next 40 years. And why is that? They're lost in the wilderness, and they're lost from God. They're out of fellowship. They're lost fellowship from God. Let's look at Amos, kind of an obscure prophet, minor prophet. Amos chapter 5, verse 25 and 26. He says, do you present me with sacrifices and grain offerings in the wilderness? Or did you present me with sacrifices and grain offerings in the wilderness for 40 years, O house of Israel? The implied answer is no, you didn't. You also carried along Succoth, your king, and Kian, your images, the star of your gods, which you made for yourselves. And so in other words, he says, I wasn't in a part of that. During those 40 years, you were worshiping other gods. Now, the Passover in Joshua 5:10 that we read about tonight is the third recorded Passover in the Old Testament. So the first one was in Exodus when they left Egypt. The next one was in Numbers chapter 9, and then the next one was 40 years later, some 40 years later in at Gilgal in Joshua 5. Then there's this idea of manna. Now manna was what God would provide daily for the needs of Israel. It's first recorded in Exodus chapter 16. I'm not going to read those verses, but you can read them. It's Exodus chapter 16. We see where it's first provided and the instructions for how that it's supposed to be gathered. You only gather up enough for your family for that day. You didn't. If you got more than that, it'd be covered with worms by the morning. This was a miraculous food that was provided daily. And here's what's interesting. In Joshua chapter 5, verse 12, we see that the manna stops. In fact, the word manna means, what is this? Is this food? Is it food? Literally, is it food? Uh, and we see that the supply of the manna stopped in chapter 5, verse 12 of Joshua. The manna ceased when? On the day after they had eaten some of the produce of the land, so that the sons of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate some of the yield of the land of Canaan during that year. Here's what struck me about this. Even though the generation that rebelled against the Lord said, you will not go into the land of Canaan. You are going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. God still didn't leave them. Why? Because he still provided for them during that time. Even when we are being disciplined by the Lord, however that may look, God still shows his mercy and his grace to us. He still provides for our needs, as he did the children of Israel. They had rebelled against God. They were even carrying their gods with them, other gods. And yet God still said, I want you to eat. He met their need. All right, the last one was the sword. It is that the Lord is the commander and we follow him. A man was standing opposite Joshua with a sword drawn in his hand. And this is only one of 3 incidents in the Old Testament of an angel or some being with a drawn sword. It's here in Joshua 5:13, but it's also, if you remember, David encountered the angel of the Lord on the threshing floor of Ornan, the Jebusite, in 1 Chronicles 21, and I think it's also recorded in 1 Kings 14 or 24, I can't remember. So that was another incident. And then the third incident of some spiritual being having a drawn sword in the Old Testament was when Balaam and his donkey encountered the angel of the Lord in Numbers chapter 22, verses 22 through 35. We're not going to read those. But it was a rare thing for this to happen. This is God as man in the Old Testament. Joshua asks him a question. He said, are you for us or are you against us? Are you for us or are you for our enemies and our adversaries? And he identified himself as the captain of the host of the Lord, the one in charge, the leader of the heavenly armies. I'm going to tell you, this was not an angel. Worship of angels was strictly forbidden. And what did Joshua do when he encountered this being? What did he do? First thing. Come on, he bowed down. He bowed down and worshiped this being. And what really gives this away that it is the Lord himself is when the captain of the Lord of the host said to Joshua, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. Now, where does this hearken back to, those words? Where does it hearken back to? Huh? Sinai, the Mount Sinai? Moses up on the mountain? Who did he encounter on the mountain? God, yes. He encountered God. It wasn't an angel. And the same words were spoken. So that's very important to understand. Let's see what time we got here. Okay. I'm going to go right to the crux of what are some spiritual lessons. And these are going to be, I'll mention most of these already, but here are some spiritual lessons. First is this one. The place, I don't care where it is, the place where you encounter God is holy. If it's right there where you're sitting in your seat, if it's up here in the front, If it's out there in the parking lot, if it's over at Walmart, if it's in your bedroom at your house, or in your closet, or at the park, where you encounter God, that is holy ground. And it is holy. Times, and another spiritual truth I think we get from this is times of covenant renewal are good. They basically renewed two covenants, circumcision and Passover. They were renewing those covenants. Hey, it's okay to renew your commitment to the Lord from time to time. Say, Lord, I've sensed myself slipping a little bit. Draw me closer to you. Let me renew myself. And that may even include baptism. There's nothing wrong with that. Through Christ, God will roll away the reproach of our sin. Just as he rolled away the reproach of Egypt from the Israelites, he rolls away the reproach of our sin when we come to him. The writer of Hebrews calls Christ the captain of our salvation. Just as this being, the Lord said, I am captain of the host of the Lord. In other words, I'm the one in charge. Christ should be the one in charge of our life. We don't direct Christ. We don't direct God. We don't tell God what to do. Never. He tells us. We follow him. And so much of what I see today is a lot of times we hear that, and it's almost like well, I'm going to tell God this, and I'm going to tell God that, and expect him to do this, and expect him to do that. We listen to the Lord. Another is that in God's care of his people, one supply doesn't end before another one begins. The manna was consistent every night. It fell. Every day they gathered it until when? They got into Canaan and they found the grain, they found the produce, they found the fruit of the land, and they began to eat that. In God's care for you, one supply will not end before another one begins. He is going to see to that. So don't be afraid that somehow you're going to lose your job. It ain't happening until God gets you another one, I promise you. All right. Only with uplifted eyes are we able to behold God. We have to look up to God. And the last one again, these are just things that came to my mind. In our battles against the enemy, we should look to the captain of our salvation. We should look to Christ and let him lead us and know that in his name there is sure and certain victory. That's all that was communicated here. So I want to encourage you for this next week. Take this handout. It's on the information center. It's just 2 pages, and find your answers. Find your study, and it takes a little time. It's not going to be done in 10 minutes, but you can take an hour or 2 this week and fill that out, and I promise you'll be blessed. You'll be encouraged, and I look forward to seeing you next week. So God bless all of you. I appreciate your attentiveness and your input tonight. You guys have a great week. I love you.